Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at nutrition through the rigorous, evidence-based clinical lens of Arbor Vitality. If you're currently in med school, residency, or out there in active clinical practice, listen up, because we're going to completely dismantle and then rebuild one of the most misunderstood yet completely underutilized tools in modern medicine: protein. Here's our clinical roadmap for today. We'll be covering protein as biological infrastructure, essential amino acid profiles, muscle, the metabolic organ, neurological and metabolic regulation, and finally, concrete clinical guidelines and dosing. All right, first things first, we need to totally reframe our perspective here. Forget the gym stereotypes, right? Forget diet culture. As medical professionals, we've got to view protein for what it actually is: foundational biological infrastructure. It is absolutely critical for systemic hormonal balance and immune resilience. Literally, if you get this prescription wrong or if your patients are deficient, everything downstream in their physiology suffers. So let's dive right into Section 1, protein as biological infrastructure. Fundamentally, we know protein is a macronutrient made up of amino acids. I like to think of these as biological building blocks. The average adult turns over roughly 250 to 300 grams of protein a day. To maintain that dynamic physiological homeostasis, the body constantly needs these specific blocks to synthesize muscle tissue, enzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters, the whole shebang. Without adequate raw materials, that constant vital repair process simply starts to fail. Moving on to Section 2, essential amino acid profiles. Now this is where it gets really interesting. When we map out these essential amino acids, the 9 our bodies can't produce, to systemic clinical outcomes, it looks almost pharmacological. Just look at the top 3, the branched-chain amino acids. Leucine activates mTOR. Isoleucine drives glucose uptake right into the muscle, which is huge for energy regulation. Valine supports nervous system function and muscle repair. But it goes way beyond that. Lysine is an absolute must for collagen formation in the skin and joints, plus calcium absorption and immune support. Methionine, that's foundational for methylation pathways, detoxification, and overall cellular health. And then there's phenylalanine, a direct precursor to neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine, which profoundly impacts cognitive performance. So when you prescribe protein to a patient, you aren't just giving them macros, you're prescribing this entire matrix of functional mechanisms. I want you to really notice leucine's specific role here. It essentially acts as the primary switch for mTOR activation. And as we know, mTOR is the central pathway dictating muscle protein synthesis, or MPS. Without enough leucine, that mTOR pathway just sits there, dormant. Muscle recovery and growth simply cannot happen optimally. It is the exact biochemical trigger we're aiming to pull with our dietary interventions. All right, let's jump to Section 3, muscle, the metabolic organ. Muscle is so much more than just cosmetic tissue. In clinical practice, we have got to view muscle as a highly active, critical metabolic organ. Protein drives the muscle resynthesis we desperately need to defend against sarcopenia, that progressive age-related loss of muscle mass. When a patient presents with muscle loss, it's not just that they're getting physically weaker. They are literally losing their primary metabolic sink for glucose. This transforms their baseline physiology straight into a state of pathology. The clinical implications here absolutely cannot be overstated. Failing to optimize muscle resynthesis directly correlates with some pretty devastating outcomes, especially in our aging populations. Low muscle mass is a primary driver of frailty, it massively accelerates metabolic dysfunction, and statistically speaking, it's highly associated with an increase in all-cause mortality. So, recommending protein isn't about fitness. It's about extending your patient's functional lifespan. It's a real game changer. Next up, Section 4, neurological and metabolic regulation. We mentioned phenylalanine a minute ago, but it's vital to remember that amino acids form the literal biochemical backbone of neurotransmitters. For example, tryptophan is necessary for serotonin, while others help build dopamine. What does this mean clinically? It means that low protein intake directly compromises cognition and mood. Think about it. When a patient comes to you presenting with brain fog, a low mood, or poor focus, before we immediately reach for a pharmaceutical intervention, we really need to step back and assess if they even have the structural amino acids required to manufacture their own neurotransmitters. And systemically, protein drives immense metabolic regulation. It actually has the highest thermic effect of food, or TEF, among all 3 macronutrients. This is the biological reason behind the infamous meat sweats, right? Your patients will literally burn more calories just digesting protein than they do digesting carbohydrates or fats. Plus, because it digests slower, it vastly increases satiety, curbs those cravings, and stabilizes blood sugar. So, from a clinical fat loss perspective, optimizing protein intake isn't just some optional add-on, it's a physiological necessity.
Which brings us to Section 5, Clinical Guidelines and Dosing.
Okay, we really need to update our guidelines here. That standard 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight that so many of us learned in school, it is grossly misunderstood. That 0.8 figure was designed merely to prevent baseline deficiency, basically just keeping a sedentary person from becoming clinically malnourished. Optimized dosing for actual biological resilience and thriving scales significantly upward based on your patient's lifestyle, their activity level, and their specific recovery needs. Furthermore, the source dictates efficacy. Complete proteins contain all 9 essential amino acids. These are typically going to be your animal-based sources: meat, fish, eggs, dairy, plus complete plant sources like tofu. On the flip side, incomplete proteins like beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds are missing one or more of those EAAs. If your patients are relying heavily on incomplete plant sources, they're going to fail to reliably trigger that mTOR synthesis pathway we discussed earlier. And finally, let's talk delivery timing. You'll want to instruct your patients to evenly distribute their daily protein intake. Think of it like a 33% split across breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The whole protocol here is designed to ensure a steady pulsing of leucine throughout their waking hours. This guarantees consistent, evenly distributed muscle protein synthesis all day long, which leads to vastly better clinical outcomes than the typical Western habit of just cramming 80% of daily protein into a single massive evening meal.
Honestly, this quote really sums up the core Arbor Vitality philosophy perfectly. Optimize protein, you optimize biology. Getting this specific macronutrient right is the ultimate foundation. If this infrastructure is solid, literally all downstream health, from musculoskeletal stability to neurotransmitter production, functions exactly as it should.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought for your clinical practice. Are you treating just to prevent deficiency, or are you prescribing to genuinely optimize? How will you shift your patients from that bare minimum baseline up to optimized metabolic and neurological health? It all starts with how we explain and prescribe biological infrastructure. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.